Hello and welcome to the July 2022 podcast from Le Monde Diplomatique. My name's George Miller, and my guest this month is journalist Anne-Dominique Correa, whose areas of expertise are Latin America and economics. Those come together in her article in this month's edition of the paper, which is entitled "In Mexico, Will Slow and Steady Win the Day?" In the piece, Anne-Dominique looks at the presidency of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, widely known as AMLO, as it passes its halfway point. The former mayor of Mexico City took the country's top job in late 2018, with a slogan of "First the Poor," and a promise to carry out the country's fourth transformation in its history, ending 2 decades of neoliberal rule. But as Anne-Dominique writes in her article, in Mexico, winning elections is not the same as taking power. Corruption is rampant, and the country's economic elite hold enormous sway. AMLO has not shied away from taking on vested interests, but his pragmatism has caused disillusionment, even feelings of betrayal, in some in his own party, Morena, the National Regeneration Movement. Others worry the party could drift into authoritarianism as it strives to cement its position in Mexican political life beyond AMLO's mandatory single term. Before we begin, just a reminder that you can find every past episode of this podcast on Le Monde Diplomatique's website, and you can subscribe on your favourite podcast app to make sure you don't miss future ones. I spoke to Anne-Dominique in early July, and I began by asking her to tell me what convinced the Mexican people that AMLO was the right man for the job in 2018. He had, after all, been painted as a danger to Mexico by its media-owning elite, and his past bids for the presidency had failed.
Well, I would say that convincing Mexican people wasn't the problem because he won president elections, but because of frauds, he couldn't access to power. So I think that his issue wasn't convincing people. He already achieved that and already knew how to do it. I think it was more a matter of trying to convince factic powers that he wouldn't be too radical. And this is something that has been very clear, that he has softened not that much his discourse or his campaign. He frequently, almost every day, talks about how neoliberalism was really a disaster for Mexico. So he's really hard and radical in his discourse and with the words he used. But in his political program, for example, in president campaigns, his political program mentions neoliberalism. And in 2018, it didn't anymore. So I think he was more pragmatic, less ambitious, maybe, in terms of to transform the country. For example, he promised that he wouldn't raise taxes. He promised that he wouldn't get into debt to increase social expenditures. So I believe that this probably helped him to really become president of Mexico. And then there's always a lot of theories of that probably there were some political pacts with the previous president or the but all of these are rumors and can be fact checked. So I can't say that was the case. But at least what is pretty clear is that he did de-radicalize a bit his political program. And then about how he convinces people, I think it's because he has a discourse of change, of trying to end this hegemony of the institutional revolutionary party, has promised to fight against corruption, and himself is his figure is very representative of this, because he's someone that's very simple. For example, he decided that he would only fly on commercial flights to try to. So he also moved because before presidents used to live in this very luxurious residence, and he decided that that will become a museum and that he will live in the national palace. So I think that also all of this symbolism is probably something that has worked.
You mentioned the example of removing references to neoliberalism in his manifesto. But at the same time, he was promising a transformation of Mexico, wasn't he? So there are references to this fourth transformation in Mexican history. So that is really quite a big promise, isn't it? Can you say what he meant when he talked about a fourth transformation?
Yeah, so when he talks about the fourth transformation, he's saying that his government will be as important for Mexico as the three previous transformations that the country has gone through, which are the independence in 1810, the Reform War also at the beginning, at mid of the 19th century, and the Mexican Revolution in 1910. So obviously these transformations were really important for and really radically changed how Mexicans lived. So by saying this, it's quite ambitious. And what does he mean? What is the transformation that he will bring? Is basically to end neoliberalism. But I think that in the Mexican context and how he defines neoliberalism, and this is very interesting and is maybe specific to Mexico, is that for him, neoliberalism was not necessarily the state lost its importance or was less powerful. It's more that the state was used for corruption and to make the elite, economic elite, even richer. So I think that this is what he means by neoliberalism, and this is what he wants to end. Obviously, what we can see so far about has he really transformed Mexico? Well, I wouldn't say so, but because his political program and his economic measures are not really as radical as a transformation would require. But I think that his view of things is that his priority right now is to secure a popular base, secure support, secure that his party will last in power for a long time so that this transformation can take place, maybe not immediately, but progressively. I liked a lot the title you chose for my article, Slowly and Steady. So I think that it's his strategy, the long-term strategy.
And we spoke earlier about the economic elite in Mexico warning of the danger of AMLO coming to power. So when he becomes president, what kind of relationship does he build, does he have with that economic elite? Because that sounds, you begin your article focusing on that. So that's clearly important.
Yes, that's the whole point of my article, of trying to explain this paradox of a leftist president that talks badly every day about the economic elite and says how much these big companies have used the state to get richer at the expense of the majority of Mexicans that haven't received the benefits of the state and Mexico's wealth. But weirdly, he has very good relations with some big businessmen that are really important. Not all of them. That's important to say. He doesn't have a good relationship with all of them, but he does have a pretty good relationship with a couple of them, and one of the most powerful ones. I would say that. So he won the elections, and before even becoming officially president, he accepted to have these informal meetings with, I remember if they were 10 or 12 of the most important businessmen of Mexico. who knows for what? Like there's no press, no one knows what is really discussed, but it's clearly a way for this businessman to try to influence the government's decisions. And most of these businessmen are the ones that have TV channels and media. So I think that for AMLO, I don't believe he really likes them. I don't think this is something. I believe this is something pragmatic, strategic. That it's better for him to have them on his side so that he can be, because they're so powerful that they can decide. They can create an economic crisis. They can, so they're so powerful that I think that his position or strategy has tried to be, will try to keep them on my side as long as possible. But of course, this comes with some costs. And as we don't know what happens in these meetings, it's impossible to say what decisions have been influenced by them. But they probably do influence him.
You make the point in your article that in Mexico you can win elections, you can ostensibly come to power, but that's not the same as really being able to exercise power. And the reason for that is because of the way corruption operates and the way economic elites dominate how things are organized in Mexico. I wonder if you could say a little bit about how AMLO has sort of tried to respond to that.
Yeah, so Mexico is really a complicated country because, first of all, winning elections doesn't mean you're going to be president, because there has been several cases of fraud. Because if you manage to become president, it doesn't mean that you will actually rule, because there's this economic elite that is so powerful and even more powerful than in other Latin American countries, because Mexico is a bigger country, it's a bigger economy. So there's a lot of even transnational companies that are very powerful. And also because Mexico is very dependent on the United States because of this free trade agreement that relates them. And due to the drug issue too, there are some places in Mexico where there's simply no rule of law because they are completely governed by narcos, basically. So all of these issues makes it very difficult for someone to actually govern. And I think that AMLO is a very clever politician because he's really strategic, and he only battles the fights he knows he can win. So sometimes this can be a bit frustrating because we would expect him to do more than what he does, but he also have all these obstacles and all these limits that make it extremely difficult for him to actually put in place a leftist political program.
I wanted to talk about two of those fights that he picked. One a smaller one a very big one. The first one was the cancellation of the new airport for Mexico City, which had already begun construction. So what was the reason behind that, and what was he wanting to say through that decision, do you think?
Yeah, so it's true that AMLO has tried to be strategic, pragmatic, and to negotiate with the economic elite. But that decision of canceling the airport was very symbolic and was a clear coup against this economic elite. And the message, I believe, was, I am the president, I am the one that is ruling Mexico. And that was made very clear. And what was the issue with this airport? The issue was, like many other big projects big public and private partnership projects that a lot of times they weren't really public-private partnerships, but it were mostly the government paying for infrastructure or whatever, and the private companies getting the benefits. And in this case, it was basically the same. And there was a lot of corruption in this airport that was also a project that didn't make much sense. So he took this very criticized and polemic decision of canceling it and building another airport. And that was a big symbolic decision. And I spoke to several businessmen when I was in Mexico for this article. And they told me that that was something that really damaged at some point the relationship between them and AMLO. Also because this is something that is not really known, but they told me that AMLO had promised them that he wouldn't do that, and he did it. They weren't happy about it, obviously.
Yeah. And then, I mean, that's quite a big decision, but the decision about the renationalization of the energy sector is even bigger. And there he faced a real challenge, not just from internal economic forces within Mexico, but also from the United States. Can you tell me a bit? And that really seemed like a big test for him, and the way that he was navigating a path through the challenges he faced.
Yes, so one of the major promises of AMLO is that he would, I don't know if nationalize the energy sector, because I think that's a big word for what he is really doing, but at least try to de-privatize or de-liberalize.
Right. Or sort of rebalance the private and the...
That would be the right word, because he presented a law to rebalance the shares of electricity produced by the public company of electricity and the private companies. Because before, in the past, the public company used to have the monopoly of the sector. But then in 2014, the ex-president Enrique Peña Nieto liberalized and the sector, and so the private companies gained much more power, specifically companies that produce green energy like wind. And this also allowed transnational companies to come to Mexico and produce electricity, like Iberdrola, for example, this Spanish transnational. And so what AMLO tried to do with this law is to rebalance a bit their shares. So it was, if I'm not wrong, to give 60% of the production to the public company and 40% to private companies. So nationalization wouldn't even be the right word. It's more rebalancing. It's not that ambitious. And this created a big problem, because it not only affected private companies in Mexico, but also transnational companies. So the US got got involved and said that they were against this measure, that it was going to ruin the market. And they also mobilized this discourse about how this measure would harm the development of the green market energy, and so that it wouldn't allow Mexico to meet the Paris Agreement goal in reducing objectives and reducing emissions. So the companies claimed that this measure wasn't constitutional. So as AMLO is very strategic, what he did was try to change the constitution to make all these claims made by the private sector not valid anymore. And this was a big big test, because to change the constitution, you need having the majority in Congress is not enough. You need to have you need the supermajority to change the constitution in Mexico, and he lost, so the constitution wasn't changed, which was a big political defeat, I believe. But in practice, I don't think it was really a defeat, even though the mainstream press didn't really present it in that way, because at the end, the first law he passed was considered constitutional. So let's say that the constitutional change was a strategy to try to make the first law be so at the end, in practice, he still won. And for many businessmen or for the private sector, this defeat with the constitutional change kind of marked a reversal, let's say, in the political situation in the country. I also forgot to say that this was a consequence of the elections that happened 6 months ago, where the president lost the supermajority in Congress, and it made the private sector in the opposition believe that maybe they have some hopes for 2024 to win elections, and also to block future constitutional changes that AMLO wants to make. So we'll see what happens. And also, what is important is to say that so this constitutional change was blocked because the opposition got together in opposition to AMLO's party. So they know that on their own they have no weight, but maybe together they can wait.
So finally, Anne-Dominique, I just wanted to ask you, now that AMLO is into the second half of his presidential term, you've talked about this sort of encouragement that the opposition has taken from this battle over energy. You also write about people within his own party, some people beginning to be worried about the direction of the party, worrying that it might follow the trajectory of previous left-wing parties in Mexico and sort of drift towards a more authoritarian side. But in a popular referendum, he scored highly, although the turnout was low. So it's difficult for someone on the outside to just sort of sum up how he's doing. And I just wondered, what things will you be looking at in the next, year or two in Mexican politics as a way of telling how the forces are playing out, the way that what sort of what are the things that you'll be keeping your eye on in Mexican politics?
I think he's doing pretty well. For example, when he lost the going to manage to change the constitution. Well, you need the supermajority for it. So okay, he doesn't have the supermajority anymore, but he still had the majority. He won this referendum, even if the participation wasn't that big. But for example, recently there were local elections and he won more states. So that clearly shows how popular he is. And then it's always difficult to measure his popularity, because it's also important to remind that almost all the media in his country is against him. Also, that a lot of international media is also, like, for example, The Economist, they always criticize him a lot. So sometimes the perception isn't really that we have abroad isn't the same, or isn't really what is happening in reality. I would say that what I would be looking at to see how well he's doing is to see if he achieves continue implementing his measures. That is clearly something that will show how powerful he still is, and how and that could give a signal of what would happen in 2024. So that's something I will definitely be looking at, and definitely the problem with his party is that, and for 2024, is that he can't present himself to the 2024 elections because this is not re-election is not allowed in Mexico. Some say, and I believe it is the case, that he is more popular than his party, and he is really the figure that makes his party together. Because, as you said, there's a lot of criticism. On the one side, there's these more ideological members of the party that are more leftist, that would really want to see Mexico be more transformed. And then on the other side, there's these more pragmatic members of the party, that some of them joined from the institutional revolutionary party, and from other parties that have more of a pragmatic and opportunistic approach of politics. So there's clearly a tension, and what makes this tension not explode is the figure of López Obrador. So the challenge would be for the party to stay together despite of these tensions, and also to find a candidate that could be as popular as AMLO. And this is really going to be a major, major challenge.
I was speaking to Anne-Dominique Correa, whose article in this month's paper is entitled "In Mexico, Will Slow and Steady Win the Day?" You can read Anne-Dominique's article at mondediplo.com. If you're a subscriber, you can also read every edition of the paper going back 25 years and online exclusive content. And if you're not yet a subscriber, there's plenty of open access content online to entice you to become one, including the full archive of this podcast. You'll find all previous episodes at Le Monde Diplomatic's website, and you can also subscribe on your favourite podcast app to make sure you don't miss future ones. In the words of John Berger, why read LMD? To make sense of what's happening in the world behind the misinformation. I hope you'll join me again soon for another interview with one of our contributors. Until then, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.